The Entrepreneur's Library, episode 61.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur's Library, the only book-centric podcast that reviews all the top-selling business books and shares authors' perspective firsthand. This is your resource to finding the next great book that will enable you to grow personally and professionally. Welcome your host, Wade Danielson.
Thank you for joining us on the EL. Today we have Nathan Furr, author of The Innovator's Method. Welcome, Nathan, and thank you for joining us on the Entrepreneur's Library.
Thanks for having me.
Will you take just a moment to introduce yourself and tell us just a little bit about you personally?
Yeah, so my name's Nathan Furr. I earned my PhD at Stanford University in the Stanford Technology Ventures program. I've worked in management consulting, I've been an entrepreneur, I've worked in venture capital, and across those experiences, wanted to spend some time sharing some of the insights that I discovered along the way.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Now let's jump right into your book, The Innovator's Method, which was just made available for purchase on September 9th, 2014. And Nathan, we're going to move quickly, but we're going to talk about the top questions that our listener/reader wants to get answered. And the first one is, what was the inspiration behind writing The Innovator's Method?
Well, when I was at Stanford, I used to hear some pretty disparaging comments about business schools and management. So, for example, some of my favorites are, Scott Cook told us that, when MBAs come to us, we have to totally retrain them. And Elon Musk said, we hire people in spite of their MBAs. And Peter Thiel said some even more harsh things about MBAs. And I asked myself, why are these folks saying such negative things about what we teach in management schools? And then I paired that with the observation when I was at Stanford, I saw the design school be created. I was part of the lean startup movement there in Silicon Valley. And I also observed how these movements kind of caught on with religious fervor. And I just asked myself the question, why so much energy and attention here? Is there really something behind it, or is it just a fad? And as I started to dig into history a little bit, I discovered something surprising to me. And that was that management schools did not exist until the late Industrial Revolution. And they were created for a very specific purpose. And that is the technology in the Industrial Revolution had transformed the economic landscape and had turned it from an economy of small businesses to an economy of industry titans that were doing things like manufacturing steel and building railroads and drilling for oil and making textiles and these kinds of things. And these huge companies created a whole new profession called management. And business schools were founded to train this profession. And what was really needed at the time was people who could coordinate these big companies, who could organize them, who could optimize them, and who could squeeze the value out of relatively known opportunities. So literally people who could make the trains run on time. And what was left out of the mix in the founding and growth of these business schools was, where did those companies come from in the first place? And how do we create the innovations? And really, I like to boil it down to a very simple distinction, and that is business schools were founded to manage problems of relative certainty. And what we left kind of unanswered was, how do we manage uncertainty? And if you think about it, innovation's all about uncertainty. It's all about something new. And as I looked around me, I realized that what I had observed, these new perspectives popping out of the woodwork, were the different disciplines' answer to how to manage uncertainty. So in engineering, it was design thinking, and entrepreneurship, it was lean startup, and computer science, it was agile software, and physics, it was active learning, and the list goes on. As the world has become more uncertainty, all the disciplines have kind of created their own little answer.
So Nathan, I think I already know the answer to my next question,
Yeah.
and that's, but I'm going to ask it anyway if anyone had missed it. But I got the answer. What makes your book different from others regarding the same topic?
Yeah, I would say that there's really a few things. One is that we are trying to synthesize all these different perspectives. So, each perspective out there offers some really useful insights, but often leaves a few pieces of the puzzle undiscovered. So by synthesizing what's common across all these methods, we can get a richer and fuller kind of end-to-end view of the innovation process. The second thing is we did a bunch of research on how entrepreneurs and managers apply this. So both groups apply this because, it's you face a certain set of challenges if you're an entrepreneur applying the innovators method, and a different set if you're a manager in a corporation that's already focused on executing, that's already using that different set of tools. And so we try to provide some insight into how both groups can apply the innovators method. And then I just say the third thing about it is I think it just puts a little flag on the mountain about the need to think seriously about how we manage uncertainty. And to be clear, I actually am not arguing that traditional management is wrong. I'm just saying it's for a specific purpose, and that if we're going to try to innovate, if we're going to try to be entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial, then we need this other set of tools.
And how would you want the reader to engage with your book if you had your choice? Is this a book that they should really read straight through from beginning to end, or is this one that they can definitely jump in, jump out, kind of cherry pick information as they need it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, this is very much a how-to book. And so, we've tried to strike a balance by making it interesting with lots of case studies and how entrepreneurs and companies apply these principles, but also give you the tools and tests that you need to use it. I would recommend you blow through it, from beginning to end, because we actually have some really good stuff at the end too. And then as you are trying to, let's say you got an idea, because this book is really all about, hey, I got an idea, or I want to get an idea, and how do I bring that to life in whatever context you're in? And so I would say, blow through it, and then as you're trying to actually bring that idea to life, then you want to go back to the book and say, oh yeah, I remember they talked about those tools, and they'll have a new richness when you read them in that light.
Perfect. So Nathan, now we're my favorite part of the entire interview, and this is where I hand over the mic and really just allow you to take us from front to back and really let us know what the book's all about. And you're talking to, an entrepreneur, a wantrepreneur, an entrepreneur, someone who's maybe working within a company, but they might be driving or walking right now, and they're wondering, is this book, is The Innovator's Method my next great read? And so will you break it down and let us know what it's all about?
Yeah, I'd say at the heart of the Innovator's Method is a process that we lay out that's kind of an end-to-end process that we saw was common across the innovators we studied. And we lay it out in a linear fashion. It doesn't mean it's always linear. We just lay it out in that linear fashion because it has to do with what are the most critical things that could kill your idea before it really can succeed. And we lay it out as a series of 4 steps before you start to scale up the business. And those 4 steps are insight, problem, solution, and business model. And what we're really saying in each of those steps, I'll drill down a bit and then I'll give you an example. Insight is all about looking for surprises in the world around you. How do you start to notice more surprises? Or when you see a surprise, let it kind of spark your imagination rather than just kind of pass by you. Those surprises are the clues or the symptoms of a deeper customer need. And once you've got insight, what we'll then propose is that, typically when somebody has an insight, they immediately start thinking of solutions. I've taught a lot of students at this point, and they almost always just jump right to the solution. And we say, whoa, hold your horses. Before that, you need to understand the problem, the customer problem or need, in terms of what we describe as the job to be done. What is really the job to be done? And every job has a functional, social, and emotional component to it. And we provide some tools and tests to really help you get at what's the need there. And if once you deeply understand that need, then you can work on the solution. And in the solution section, we talk about how you can leverage 4 really hyper rapid prototypes. We call them the theoretical prototype, virtual prototype, minimum viable product, which many of you have heard of, and then the minimum awesome product to get a solution that delights customers and kind of almost sells itself. And then lastly, you want to align the business model by discovering the right go-to-market strategy. And when you've done those things, then you're ready to scale the business. And I wrote a previous book that was titled Nail It, Then Scale It. And it was simply to emphasize the dangers of scaling early. And if you don't mind, I'll give you a quick example of this in application. And actually, since corporations have such a hard time innovating, I'll give a corporate example since it's illustrative how a big company could do this, but the exact same thing applies to startups, which is a lot of the focus of my study. In India, there's a company called Godrej and Boyce Manufacturing, and they're a 110-year-old company that really succeeded by bringing really high-end products from places like the States and bringing them to the top income tier of folks in India. So they operate mostly in India. So making safes and refrigerators, high-end refrigerators, and they faced a challenge, and that was that their business was starting to erode as lower cost competitors came into the market, like a Samsung or an LG selling cheaper refrigerators. And so they said, we got to innovate, we got to do something. And so they started to look around, and the seed of the process started with an insight, like I described. And it was this surprise that about only 20% of Indian households have a refrigerator. So they said, hey, there's an insight. We could use that to build a big business. Now, remember, I warned you that most entrepreneurs jump right to the solution, and that's exactly what they did. They said, I know what we'll do. We know what we'll do. We'll build a smaller version of the refrigerator, and we'll advertise it through our typical advertising channels and sell it in our stores because, hey, wouldn't everybody like to have refrigeration? Why wouldn't a kid out in a village in India also want what that kid in the city has? I mean, makes sense, right? Just you're good at making refrigerators, just make a smaller, cheaper version and sell through your existing channels. Now, fortunately, they were doing some work with Clay Christensen, who wrote the introduction to our book and who got us access to Godrej. But they said, whoa, we need to slow things down. And so remember, I said, after insight is you got to understand the problem. What's the job to be done? So they sent teams out into villages in India to kind of observe what was the need, and what they saw totally surprised them and changed everything they believed about the right solution. They observed that in these rural villages in India that often power wasn't available 24 hours a day, so that immediately negated their little refrigerator option. They saw that these people had very limited stores. They were buying fruits and vegetables and having every single day at a higher price. They had limited income. There were all these other challenges and all these pieces that fed into what's the real functional and emotional and social need here. And they then turned to the next step. I talked about solutions using these 4 prototypes. They used a bunch of theoretical prototypes and then virtual prototypes and then minimum viable prototypes to really create something that was totally different. And what they ended up creating was essentially what we in the Western world would recognize as it looking like a cooler with a detachable lid. And the detachable lid had all the cooling mechanisms, except they used solid state electronic cooling instead of the traditional refrigerator coolants. And they put the battery in the lid, and they made it all so they could sell it for $50. And the beauty of this was, it's opens on the top so the cool air stays inside. It's the right size for an average family's needs. The lid being detachable turned out to be really important because they discovered these folks don't have ways to get a broken cooler back and forth to a service center. So now they can just take off the lid and take that to the service center. And they really created a radically different innovation as a result. And then they had to discover what was the business model. And it took them a while to figure it out. They played around with India Post. They played around with an entrepreneurial firm called Dharma Life. And they started to discover what was the right business model. And I'll just wrap up by saying by following this process, they avoided the typical mistake of wasting a ton of money on time building something nobody wanted. Nobody wanted the little fridge that they had envisioned. Nobody would have heard about that little fridge through their traditional marketing channels, and nobody would have gotten access to it through their traditional distribution channels. Instead, they followed this process and created a whole new category.
So Nathan, you just did an awesome job of breaking down your book, and now we're going to ask you to do the same thing again to break it down even further. And
Okay.
that's that if the reader can only take away one concept, principle, or action item out of your entire book that you just discussed, what would you want that to be?
The one principle would be that if you are facing uncertainty, and it could be that you have an idea that you want to bring to market, it could be that you're facing a challenge in your workplace, it could be you're facing a challenge in your life, you want to employ a different way to manage that uncertainty. And it has to do with this: you want to identify your unexamined assumptions, you want to design a reliable but low cost and rapid experiment to test that assumption. And then lastly, you want to change when you discover what the answer was. And you want to do that as fast as possible. So it's action oriented.
I think I just pulled some quotes out of that, and that leads into our next question,
Yeah.
which is, do you have a favorite quote from your book?
Yeah, actually, I mean, it may seem kind of weird, but it's very simple. Innovators innovate, customers validate. And it sounds kind of weird, but a lot of times I find, managers and entrepreneurs will go to customers and say, "What do you want?" But customers have a really hard time telling you what they want. There's actually psychological reasons for that we call functional fixedness, which is it's just hard to imagine outside the box of the status quo when you're in it. And so the point is that it's the innovator's job or the entrepreneur's job to go out there, observe the need, propose something that could solve it, and then let the customers tell them whether it's right or wrong. And the more disruptive and the more kind of paradigm changing your innovation, the more you have to adapt that process for the fact that people might not like it till they try it. But the point is, it's a really action-oriented paradigm. One of the things that surprises me most is sometimes when people read my stuff or they take my class, they walk away thinking, "Oh, we need to do a lot more research." And I'm like, "No, I'm actually saying you need to get out there right now." So if you have an idea, draw it on a piece of paper and ask somebody about it tomorrow. I would say ask yourself the question, if I had to sell this tomorrow, what would I sell? Create that and start getting those customers to validate your innovation.
That's huge. I especially like that last piece where you said if if you had to sell it tomorrow, that would
Yeah,
really cause you to have to focus on exactly the point that you need to get across. So
yeah,
that's fantastic. And you talked
yeah.
about paradigm shifts just a minute ago, and that's what we're looking for in this last question. It's is there a book that you've read that really created a paradigm shift, changed your life, had a huge impact on you, and will you share that?
I would say yeah. Um, I'm going to give you a business book, and I'm going to give you a non-business book, since I'm all about innovation and being interdisciplinary. So
Perfect.
the business book that I most admire is Clay Christensen. I mentioned he wrote the foreword on our book and gave us some advice. He wrote The Innovator's Dilemma, and it's a clear, concise message about a fundamental puzzle of innovation, which is why do good companies fail when they're doing good things? And just it's fabulously done. And there's been some debate in the media and the New Yorker, and it's a paradigm changing book, and the paradigm is real. The non-business book actually that probably influenced me profoundly, ironically, was Goethe's Faust. And you say, what in the world is he talking about? But in the beginning of that book, Goethe gives the image of the grasshopper who is always leaping up towards the skies and then falling back down. And it's a metaphor for our kind of human predicament that we leap and try, and yet we're bound in some ways by our very nature to not always do our very best. And I guess I remember that because in as an entrepreneur, when you're trying to innovate, or myself when I'm writing this book, this book is me as a grasshopper leaping up and trying my best. Is it perfect? No, of course not. Are the things that if we sat down, I would tell you, things to be, contingencies and things? Of course I would. And in 5 years, I hope to have an even better answer. And I just think that's the nature of being an entrepreneur and the nature of life, is that we're always trying our best. And we have to accept that we're human and we're limited. And the key is to try again, to be that grasshopper and keep jumping.
Excellent. Thank you for both of those. I know very well the first one and hadn't even heard of the second one, so I appreciate both of those.
You'll get it in your literature class. So, but it's really it's an out there category.
So, Nathan, before we depart, can you recommend the best way for our listeners to get more information on you and the Innovators Method?
Yeah, so we have a website called it's www.theinnovatorsmethod.com. So the title of the book, the whole thing, that's a great spot to find out more. And you can find it if you go to Amazon and look for the book. You can find us that way too. Those are probably the two best ways.
Perfect. Well, Nathan, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your book, your creation with our audience.
Thanks so much for having me, Wade. This has been fabulous.
Thanks again for listening in today. If you'd like to get your hands on the Innovators Method or any of the other resources mentioned by Nathan, just look at the show notes at theelpodcast.com.
Looking for your next book idea? Head over to theelpodcast.com, where Wade shares his amazing resource, the top 10 business books recommended by over 500 entrepreneurs, with you for free. That's theelpodcast.com. Till the next time, keep it on the EL.